In America today, teachers, cops, judges, and other so-called public servants make far more than the average taxpayer. And their pensions, well, if the people knew, they'd join us. That's where you come in. Taxpayers United of America is embarking on a great new project to train activists how to take on the parasites in your communities. The entire process, from prying loose the facts to disseminating the truth to the people. The first of these great workshops is in Orlando, Saturday, March 7th. It's just $25. For more information, go to taxpayersunited.org/govpensions. All right, you guys, welcome back. I'm Scott Horton. It's my show, The Scott Horton Show. I promise I'll get back to debunking Netanyahu and the Iran stuff here in a little while. But first, it's our good friend Sheldon Richman, Vice President of the Future of Freedom Foundation and editor of their journal, The Future of Freedom, which is just $25 a year, $15 to read it online. That's fff.org/subscribe for The Future of Freedom. It's Sheldon and Jim Bovard and, of course, Jacob Hornberger in every issue, and then plus a lot of other great writers, too. And so, yeah, that's fff.org/subscribe. Welcome back to the show. Sheldon, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and always glad to be back. Thanks, Scott.
Good, good. Very happy to talk to you again. So, hey, man, teach me some history. Looks like you got a two-part series. Is that a series if it's two parts? A two-parter at the Future Freedom Foundation. The War of 1812 was the health of the state, part 1 and 2. So I guess start with the title there. What does that mean, health of the state?
Yeah, I guess I usually write current events, so this. I guess I'm a little late writing about this one, but I wasn't around in 1812 to 1815.
That's pretty anti-war, though, if you're even anti-war of 1812. I'll give you credit.
Yeah, I think it actually makes the case and even stronger, so I can elaborate on that. But to get back to this phrase, the health of the state, most people will recognize that was a wonderful phrase coined in 1918 by Randolph Bourne. Randolph Bourne was sort of an individualist progressive writer. He was kind of an odd mixture of philosophies there. I think he even called himself an anarchist, but on the other hand, he supported some government stuff. But that aside, when all his progressive friends were jumping on Woodrow Wilson's war wagon in 1917, when Wilson decided he wanted to get into the European War, the so-called Great War, Bourne was like the only one of his crowd. He was a journalist, the only one of his crowd really, who said, "Wait a second, this is nuts. You guys aren't going to control the war." The progressives thought that they could guide the war effort and actually use it to create reform at home. He said, "You're all crazy." And of course, he was right and they were wrong. So in writing this essay, he died before he finished it. Unfortunately, I believe he had got a flu or serious disease that was going around. He was writing a longer essay called "The State," maybe even a book, and the famous phrases will be found in that called "War is the health of the state," and he explains how in times of peace in a republic, most people don't pay much attention to the government. It doesn't have the majesty and the trappings because people are just busy with their lives and they're not much thinking about it. But when the state comes into its own in wartime, and he describes what that means, you can find this essay at anywar.com or lots of other places on the web. It's definitely worth reading. So that's where the title comes from. War, the great Robert Higgs, of course, has a whole book, Crisis and Leviathan, which documents this further, that war and crisis seem to be related to war, economic crises too, always end up boosting the power of the state, and the power never falls back to the pre-crisis dimension. It stays big. I mean, they may shed a few powers, but they never undo everything and go back to how things were before the crisis. So that's the idea about the war boosting state power. It provides all kinds of opportunities to, for politicians to aggrandize themselves, and they don't give up that power easily.
Well, and of course, it's pretty ironic that one of the greatest statements along these lines that can be cited, particularly if you're arguing with, say, like conservative right-wing nationalists, would be James Madison, the principal author of the Constitution, who, I don't know if this was a speech or an essay or a letter he wrote, the most dreaded enemy of liberty, where Madison himself, the guy who created the provision that says that Congress can create armies is the one saying, "Oh, that's the last thing you want to do here," and he
Right.
really goes on. It's a very quotable thing. I'm sure you've quoted it plenty of times
It's just the
in
source
the
of all
past
bad
yourself.
things. Debt, taxes, jobbery, executive power. But here's irony of ironies. Madison was the president who took the country into war against England in 1812. He got a declaration, or at least he got a declaration of war. I guess we can't hold him responsible for that. Came later for the first executive war without Congress. But he went to war, and the Republicans and Madison himself saw opportunities to increase the size of government in war. And as the war was coming on, lots of Republicans at the time, he was a Republican, the Federalists were against the war. The Federalists in New England were threatening to secede because of the war. They were friendly to England, and they thought the war was crazy, and they didn't think the U.S. was even prepared for war. England was the greatest naval power on earth, and the U.S. didn't have much of a navy, and the Congress wouldn't even vote to create a navy as the war was coming. It did during the war. It added ships. But the Republicans saw great opportunities in this war, the kind of things that ought to make libertarians and others very uncomfortable.
Now hang on one second, Sheldon, because I know that both articles are really about the domestic consequences, and that really is the point. But we got to talk a second here about getting into this thing. I mean, the fact that the country was as divided as you're saying would seem proof positive that this was unnecessary. If half the states thought it was unnecessary at the time, as you say, threatened even to secede over it. So, can you without necessarily getting into the details of how true it all was or how justified any of it was or whatever, can you refresh us on the casus belli here? What was?
Sure.
I guess I remember from grade school. Well, they were impressing our sailors on the high seas. Is that it?
Yeah. So that was part of it. The consequences weren't all domestic, though, but we can get into that later if there's time. But as far as the causes, England is fighting France at this time, right? The Napoleonic Wars are on, and both England and France are trying to stop the U.S. from delivering goods, just consumer goods and other things, to the other country. Now, England doesn't want France having the goods, and France doesn't want England having the goods. So they were both sides were interfering with U.S. shipping with neutral rights, and of course the shippers and the merchants were upset about this. Jefferson had retaliated by putting on an embargo. He gets an embargo, a comprehensive embargo passed in 1807 that forbade all exports, American exports, not just to England and France, all exports, because exports, he called this peaceful coercion. He thought this was a way short of war to stop these two powers from doing this. It didn't work. It failed. And Madison felt there was nothing left to do now but go to war. Now, you're right. The English were grabbing merchant seamen from American ships, claiming that they were actually British and deserters and putting them in the Navy. So my point is, even a war that on the face of it seems like a good war, a justified war, because interference with neutral shipping and grabbing sailors off the high seas, that sounds like, those are bad things.
Although it does kind of sound like Thomas Jefferson was Bill Clinton to Madison's George W. Bush here, kind of getting us into this mess, and then Madison exploits the crisis his predecessor created.
Well, right, because, they saw that the America's pride was on the line, honor, sovereignty. Don't forget, it's not that long after the Revolution. Sovereignty, independence. The war ended up being called the Second War for American Independence. So Madison felt there was no choice now. Nothing else was working, and so they had to attack England. Now, they had some other things on the agenda. They wanted Canada. They wanted to grab Canada. Don't forget, American leaders, rulers from the very beginning had this idea of manifest destiny, even if that phrase wasn't coined until about 1845, I think. They believed that America was the rising new empire in the world. The European empires were tired and old and worn out, and the U.S. was destined to rule the Western Hemisphere, certainly all of North America. And so Canada was on the agenda. Now, they didn't make it. They got the army invaded it. In fact, some state militias refused to go into Canada, saying, we're not allowed to go into foreign countries. We're state militias. So they wouldn't go. But the army did go, but they got pushed back. They got repulsed. They burned the Canadian capital of York at that time, and England retaliated by burning Washington.
All right, hold it right there. We'll be right back, y'all, with the great Sheldon Richman on the War of 1812 right after this. Phone records, financial and location data, Prism, Tempora, X-Keyscore, Boundless Informant. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for offnow.org. Now, here's the deal. Due to the Snowden revelations, we have a great opportunity for a short period of time to get some real rollback of the national surveillance state. Now, they're already trying to tire us by introducing fake reforms in the Congress. And the courts, they betrayed their sworn oaths to the Constitution and Bill of Rights again and again, and can in no way be trusted to stop the abuses for us. We've got to do it ourselves. How? We nullify it at the state level. It's still not easy. But the Off Now project of the 10th Amendment Center has gotten off to a great start. I mean it. There's real reason to be optimistic here. They've gotten their model legislation introduced all over the place, in state after state. I've lost count, more than a dozen. You're always wondering, yeah, but what can we do? Here's something important, something that can work if we do the work. Get started cutting off the NSA support in your state. Go to offnow.org. All right, guys, welcome back. I'm Scott. It's my show. I'm talking with Sheldon Richman, Vice President of the Future Freedom Foundation. And Sheldon, did you see that thing in Harper's by Andrew Coburn about how his great-great-grandfather, Admiral whatever, Coburn of the British Imperial Navy, was the one who burnt Washington, D.C. and freed all the slaves and turned the place upside down?
I don't know if I saw that or not.
Oh, man, it's great. I think I have the PDF here somewhere he sent me. I'll forward it on to you. It's a really great story. This is Alex, Andrew, and Patrick Coburn's great-great-great-great-grandfather. Something was, I don't know his title. Some fancy title. And he was the one who sacked D.C., apparently. And anyway. So, now, the real point of this is the War of 1812 is the health of the state, the dreaded enemy of liberty, as Madison himself put it here. And now talk about this. It seems like you mentioned in the article here, and you end up getting to the Kagans, for crying out loud, but not to get too far ahead of ourselves. It does sound like national greatness became, if I understand you right, you're saying that, Weekly Standard style national greatness became a project of the founding fathers themselves as they were getting older. I'm familiar with Jefferson complaining about the useless sacrifice of the generation of 1776, so it can all be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons and all that. But I think you're saying here they all pretty much thought that way, and that was part of what led to the war. Was they thought that the revolution had worked too well, and they wanted to a counter-revolution to some degree to set things right. What are you talking about there, or what the hell am I talking about?
Well, Gordon Wood, this doesn't come from Robert Kagan. Gordon Wood, who's an eminent historian of the early, the colonies and the Revolution and the early Republic, has a book called The Radicalism of the American Revolution, where he points out that in the last chapter that every one of the founders died disappointed in what had happened, what America had become, because it was a commercial republic where basically people were concentrating on their own economic well-being and their own and their family. They weren't civic minded. There wasn't this civic republicanism, this idea where everyone is thinking about the nation. How can we improve the nation? How can I serve the nation? And they all despaired about that, Republican and Federalist alike. They might have had different approaches to this spirit, but they didn't like this selfishness, this commercialism that they saw all around them. So when the war was coming along, the Republicans and Madison and others, Albert Gallatin, who was sort of the anti-Hamiltonian who took over the Treasury when the Republicans came in with Jefferson, they all saw this war as having a potential to sort of give the American people a shot in the arm of national fervor. And Gallatin says after the war, people thought of themselves as a nation now, as Americans. And they were happy about this. This was a good thing. This was a spillover from the war. That they didn't see any other way to get this. I'm not saying they went into the war for that, but they saw the benefit. They saw that as a benefit of the war, and it shaped thinking after that. That we needed a national purpose. That's how they saw things. There wasn't a national purpose before that, and so they were delighted. They were delighted by that, and it gets translated into the view of government as the war is ending. Monroe and Madison, who follow Monroe and John Quincy Adams, who follow Madison, have a much bigger government in mind. They want internal improvements. They like Henry Clay's American system, which included tariffs and building of canals, and Quincy Adams says the purpose of government is to look after the well-being of the people, the political, the moral, the social well-being of people. These were not small government people. These were not libertarians. And war is, like I say, war is the health of the state. Plus, it also fueled future expansion. They realized that expansionism could work. They threatened war. They held their own against the British. There was no winner. When they wrote the treaty, it didn't even talk about impressment or neutral shipping rights. It just sort of said status quo ante. But the British were very much interested in accommodating the Americans at this point. They didn't want to fight the Americans anymore. And so they end up, settling the boundary between Canada and America. And America uses that. Madison and others, Monroe and Adams use it later against the Spanish, saying, look what we did. They had some major victories over the British Navy, the American Navy, which was much smaller and newer. And yet they succeeded, like on the Great Lakes and other places. So this was a sign to the other European powers, Spain primarily, that don't mess with us. This is our hemisphere. We are destined to rule this whole hemisphere. And they proceeded to do it. They moved. They got to the Pacific. Within a few years afterwards, they had territory all the way to the Pacific, and which they saw as an entryway to China. This is how they were thinking, and then they started building a global navy, not in 1898 when they went formally to war against Spain, but in the after 1815.
Mm-hmm. And now you even quote Grover Cleveland calling these conservatives a bunch of communists.
The American system. Clay, I guess, gave it the name, or it's identified with him, but it's basically Hamilton's system, was picked up by Monroe and Madison. It then suffers some setbacks because when Jackson becomes president, he's more relatively speaking, laissez-faire, and so is his successor, Martin Van Buren. So there's kind of a rally for the small government decentralists. But then they end up losing because Lincoln brings the American system in full force to the country with a national bank and tariffs and everything, and that basically stays in existence up until the present day. And I pointed out that Grover Cleveland, who was among the more laissez-faire-ish of the presidents, relatively speaking, again, he complained about corporatism. He didn't use that term, but he talked about all the privilege for big business, and he called it the communism of wealth and capital. And he said that's what stimulates the other kind of communism. In other words, he said communism wasn't the result of just envy of rich people. It was a backlash to privilege that rich people got from the state. In other words, it's the old Marxian thing that the state was the executive committee of the ruling class. That's exactly what Cleveland complained about. Now, he didn't undo it. Maybe he wasn't able to undo it, but the point is he complained about it, and he actually attributes the rise of communism, the working class kind of communism, to the backlash against how business was riding roughshod over the American people. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it's not what we learn, and it's not the typical libertarian version of history. I think libertarians traffic too much in fairy tales when it comes to history. Like we had this great laissez-faire past, and it all went wrong when? In the New Deal. Okay, maybe some things went wrong in 1898 with the war against Spain.
Well, where they get that misunderstanding, because that's the propaganda from the other side, is that everything was laissez-faire until the Great Depression kind of thing, and so they got to go back and relearn a lot of stuff.
That's not the only reason. That's not the only reason. I think there's this golden past that libertarians like to point to, and it's a way of saying to non-libertarians, look, this is our heritage. Look, we just want to get back to this. And if you look at it too closely, you'll see, if you look at it close, not too closely, look at it closely, you'll see you don't want to get back to that. You don't want to get back to that.
Yeah, no, of course.
Look, we have John Quincy Adams, who's often quoted favorably because he said America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. He thought the Constitution, there was a terrible mistake in the Constitution, namely Congress got the war power. He said that's an executive power. Everywhere else it's an executive power. It should be an executive power here. During the Monroe administration, when Adams was the Secretary of State, General Andrew Jackson invaded Florida, right, which was possessed by the Spanish at the time, killed a bunch of Indians, killed some British soldiers of fortune, they weren't in the army, they were just adventurers, executed after trying some of them. Congress went bananas and said, we didn't declare war. Why did Jackson go in there? Some in Congress did, like Henry Clay. The Monroe administration, led by Adams, defended Jackson to the hilt and said he did nothing wrong. It set the precedent for executive war. That it goes back then. It didn't start with the Korean War. All this stuff goes all the way back to the beginning. They wanted an empire. It was manifest destiny. God has ordained this. And these guys were driven. Of course, they also liked the power because, people like the fur traders, like the big fur trader, John Jacob Astor, had Monroe's ear the whole time and was getting favors. Trade, here's the big thing that comes out of the war. Trade is now formally a government program. Even the free traders saw it as something pushed by government, not just privately done, but government was in charge of opening markets. That's a statist program.
Right. Well, and in fact, here, let me keep you one more minute. Talk about the changes in taxation.
Well, the Republicans had been against internal taxes, right? They were okay on some, tariffs for raising revenue, not so much to interfere with trade, but just to raise revenue. They saw that as an external tax. They didn't like internal taxes, but with the war, they needed the money. And Congress passed internal taxes during the war, or as the war was coming up. And Madison even says, oh, thank goodness the Republicans have got down their dose of taxes. Like they finally took the medicine that they needed to take. But even then, they couldn't cover the costs, and the government had to borrow, and banks popped into existence and inflated, and the government let them suspend specie payments, and the result eventually was the Panic of 1819, which Murray Rothbard wrote about. His doctoral dissertation was on the Panic of 1819, and his history of money and banking in the United States discusses this chapter in American history. So we get a bad panic and depression in 1819 because of the war and inflation and government borrowing. All the stuff that Madison warned about, he then did. In other words, they thought somehow they could fight a Republican war. In other words, have the war without all of the intrinsic features that war has. And they couldn't do it. As I say in the second part, which will be published this week, they could sooner square the circle than to fight a war that didn't have those intrinsic features. Yeah.
When you talk about the mythology that that libertarians believe in, they're kind of the more right-leaning ones usually. They tend to lean toward the explanation that it's democracy that killed the republic rather than it's the empire that killed the republic. But what you're explaining here for certain is that it's always been the war machine that makes the so-called system of the rule of law under the Constitution null and void.
Yeah, yes, but the people, yes, it wasn't democracy, but the people loved it. I'm not saying the people were against it. The people loved it. They loved how the war came out. They thought that Madison was able to dictate terms to England, even though the Treaty of Ghent shows no such dictation of terms, but people thought that. They loved Jackson. The Great Battle of New Orleans, of course, occurred after the signing of the peace treaty.
Yeah, but I just mean, the chains of the Constitution are thrown off not by a bunch of poor people voting themselves food stamps and whatever. They're thrown off by the Pentagon. They're its precursors, the presidents and exercising their war powers. They're the ones that make this, that, and the other section null and void. As you say, they're the ones who invent the conception of American citizenship rather than your state, or turning these United States into the United States and all these kinds of things on down the line. That's the origin of it all. Like Donald Sutherland explains to Jim Garrison in the JFK movie, what's all this about, all these marble temples and statues? It's the war power. That's what it's all about here. Never mind the Constitution. That's long gone.
Right. I mean, look, Jefferson knew he had no constitutional power to buy Louisiana from Napoleon. And it wasn't just Louisiana, of course. It was the territory, which was much larger than the state of Louisiana. He knew it. He was prepared. Actually, he was preparing a constitutional amendment and then decided, let's not raise the issue. Let's just go ahead and do it. And no one made a fuss. And then, so the presidency becomes inflated very early on, but with Jefferson, it's like even worse when the Republicans come in, because Jefferson was supposedly a small government guy, and he ends up doubling the size of the country just by buying territory. And then under Monroe, Adams does the same thing. I mean, with Spain, he negotiates a huge transcontinental treaty, which gives the U.S. Territory all the way to the Pacific. All the way to the Pacific Ocean. And, again, I don't know if it doubled it again, but it certainly enlarged it quite a bit. And their scope was global. They wanted Hawaii. They wanted Cuba. They wanted open markets in China. They wanted to battle Russia in the Northwest Territory, because Russia had outposts there for a very long time, and they wanted to push Russia out. They wanted to push England out. Like I said, they wanted Canada. They weren't able to get it. Then they turned their focus to Texas and Mexico. They never got that, because here's the interesting thing. I know you're very fond of Madison's point about ambition countering ambition. And that seems like a good policy, and it didn't really work out in practice, except in one ironic way. The people the expansionists would have wanted Texas and Mexico, but what stopped them, what caused them to put all that off for a long time, is that they didn't want the slave power to extend to those territories. So they said, we don't want the slave, we don't want Texas to come in as a slave state eventually, so let's not go for Texas now. So in their big 1819 or 1821 treaty with Spain under Quincy Adams, they were willing to say, okay, let's not talk about Texas. You can have Texas. We want the Pacific Northwest. And so they, in a way, made an exchange, but it was mainly because they didn't want the slave power to expand.
Yeah, well, there's one good thing you can say about them. Only it's really just about the votes, not the morality of the situation, right? So
the slave power ambition countered the expansionist ambition. There's an interesting use of ambition countering ambition.
Which, by the way, I mean, I usually cite that as, our last ditch hope that these pigs can be turned against each other. It's mostly their public relations, that the checks and balances built into the system actually work, and that we have federalism, that we have a rule of law at all, which, of course, as we're discussing, is really not the case.
Right.
But you'd like to think that, like a real big-headed federal prosecutor might put a governor in prison sometimes, and then we celebrate the little victories,
Sure. Yeah, sometimes that'll happen. I don't think anything terribly significant. Look at the war power. But I think if we did a counter history or counterfactual history, if there had been no slavery, so everybody was anti-slave, they would have gone after Texas and beyond.
Sure.
Because there would have been no concern. Or if everybody was pro-slave, they would have gone after Texas. Yeah, Jefferson foresees an empire of liberty. That was his term. Of course, they have to tag the word liberty on there. But he thought the whole Western Hemisphere, South America too, not that it would be formally annexed, but it would be under the influence, one language he even said, under the influence of the United States. The United States would be the guiding light. His plan, his idea for the Great Seal of the United States was the people of Israel and a pillar of light coming down from the heavens. That was Jefferson's idea and Jefferson was a deist, right? That was his idea for the Great Seal. I guess it didn't make it through the focus groups, but this is how they saw things. These guys, look, you can pick out libertarian lines here and there in their thinking, and of course, domestically they wanted a fairly liberal environment, right? They didn't want what King George was able to do with the soldiers, bursting into people's homes and stuff like that. No, they didn't want that. Nobody wanted. The Federalists pretty much didn't want that either. They didn't want arbitrary government. They wanted self-government, but that doesn't really mean limited government. It just means it's not arbitrary. It's got to go through procedures, including, people being able to vote, although obviously not everybody had to vote. And when it came to the presidency, they basically thought the Congress would be picking the president each time. They always thought,
we got to go, dude. We're about to start this next segment again.
Okay.
But thanks so much, man. Great work, Sheldon. Appreciate your time.
I enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye.
All right, y'all, that's the great Sheldon Richman, FFF.org. The War of 1812 was the health of the state. Part 1 and 2 will be up there very soon. Oh, John Kerry's Mideast peace talks have gone nowhere. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for the Council for the National Interest at councilforthenationalinterest.org. U.S. military and financial support for Israel's permanent occupations of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is immoral, and it threatens national security by helping generate terrorist attacks against our country. And face it, it's bad for Israel, too. Without our unlimited support, they would have much more incentive to reach a lasting peace with their neighbors. It's past time for us to make our government stop making matters worse. Help support CNI at councilforthenationalinterest.org. Hey, all, Scott Horton here. It's always safe to say that one should keep at least some of your savings in precious metals as a hedge against inflation. And if this economy ever does heat back up and the banks start expanding credit, rising prices could make metals a very profitable bet. Since 1977, Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. has been helping people buy and sell gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, and they do it well. They're fast, reliable, and trusted for more than 35 years. And they take Bitcoin. Call Robertson Roberts at 1-800-874-9760 or stop by rrbi.co. You hate government? One of them libertarian types? Or maybe you just can't stand the president, gun grabbers, or warmongers. Me too. That's why I invented libertystickers.com. Well, Rick owns it now, and I didn't make up all of them, but still, if you're driving around and want to tell everyone else how wrong their politics are, there's only one place to go. Libertystickers.com has got your bumper covered. Left, right, libertarian, empire, police, state, founders, quotes, central banking. Yes, bumper stickers about central banking. Lots of them. And, well, everything that matters. Libertystickers.com. Everyone else's stickers suck. Hey, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new book by Michael Swanson, The War State. In The War State, Swanson examines how Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy both expanded and fought to limit the rise of the new national security state after World War II. If this nation is ever to live up to its creed of liberty and prosperity for everyone, we are going to have to abolish the empire. Know your enemy. Get The War State by Michael Swanson. It's available at your local bookstore or at Amazon.com in Kindle or in paperback. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org or thewarstate.com.